The scream echoed through virgin timber at 11:47 a.m., then cut off like a radio yanked from its socket. 10 men had entered the Appalachian wilderness that morning with crosscut saws and dreams of easy money. This is the story of how the mountains claimed 8 of them, leaving behind only whispers, shattered equipment, and 2 survivors who would never speak the same again. The Black Rock Timber Company's final logging expedition into what locals called Devil's Hollow would become the most documented vanishing in West Virginia history, spawning investigations that continue to this day. I want to know where you're watching from right now. Drop a comment below and let me know what time it is where you are. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in company records and witness testimonies for over a century. The morning of October 13th, 1911, brought the crisp bite of mountain air, the metallic tang of axe heads, and the rough bark of ancient hemlocks under calloused palms. Black Rock Timber had won the logging rights to 1,200 acres of untouched Appalachian forest, despite warnings from Cherokee elders who still remembered when their people considered this particular valley sacred ground. Samuel Hartwell, the expedition foreman, had assembled his crew at the makeshift camp 3 miles from Beckley. The men represented the backbone of Appalachian logging: Irish immigrants seeking steady wages, local mountain men who knew every creek and ridge, and drifters following timber booms across the eastern frontier. Each carried the tools of their trade and the confidence that comes from years of felling giants. From Hartwell's expedition log, October 13th, 1911, weather fair. Creek running high from recent rains. Men in good spirits despite local superstitions about the hollow. Expect to reach the Virgin Stand by midday. The crew included the Morrison brothers, twins who could drop a 100-foot oak within inches of their target. Big Jim Kowalski, a Polish immigrant whose shoulders seemed carved from the same timber he felled. Young Tommy Fletcher, barely 18, eager to prove himself among seasoned loggers. And Ezra Whitman, the camp cook, whose stories could make beans and hardtack taste like Sunday dinner. None of them had worked Devil's Hollow before. The previous logging outfit had abandoned their contract after losing 2 men to what the company called industrial accidents. But Black Rock needed the timber, and Hartwell needed the money. His wife was expecting their 3rd child, and logging wages could set a family up for years if a man survived the work. The trail into Devil's Hollow descended through layers of geological time. Limestone cliffs gave way to sandstone ridges, then dropped into a valley where coal seams leaked sulfur into mountain streams. The trees grew larger as they descended, hemlocks and chestnuts that predated European settlement, their canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. What none of them knew was that 3 miles behind them, a Cherokee woman named Ayanna sat outside her cabin, burning sage and speaking words her grandmother had taught her, words meant to protect foolish white men from awakening something that had slept in the hollow since her people were driven west. But some hungers are older than prayers. The first sign of trouble came when their compass began spinning like a child's toy. Tommy Fletcher, tasked with marking their route, noticed the needle swinging in lazy circles, unable to find magnetic north. Hartwell dismissed it as interference from the coal deposits, but the older loggers exchanged glances that spoke of deeper concerns. By afternoon, they'd reached the Virgin Stand Black Rock had purchased. Trees stood like cathedral pillars, some over 200 feet tall, their trunks so wide that 3 men holding hands couldn't encircle them. The silence was absolute, broken only by their own breathing and the distant murmur of water over stone. Big Jim Kowalski later testified, "Wasn't natural quiet. Even the birds had stopped singing. Should have turned back right then, but the trees. Lord help us. The money those trees represented." They made camp as shadows lengthened, setting up canvas tents in a rough circle around their cooking fire. Ezra prepared their evening meal while the others sharpened their tools, the scrape of whetstones against steel creating an oddly musical rhythm. The Morrison twins scouted the perimeter, identifying the first trees they'd fell come morning. That's when they found the bones. Not animal bones. The femur Tommy Fletcher discovered while gathering firewood was unmistakably human, bleached white by mountain weather, but still bearing tool marks that suggested something had gnawed on it. Methodically, deliberately, around the bone, arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly, lay rusted logging equipment from previous expeditions, saw blades twisted into shapes that defied physics, boot leather arranged like an offering, and carved into the bark of surrounding trees, symbols that seemed to writhe in the firelight. Had these men stumbled into something beyond their understanding, or had their presence awakened something that had been waiting in the hollow for decades, growing hungrier with each passing season? None of them slept well that night, though none would admit it come morning. What they didn't know was that 8 miles away, Ayanna had awakened screaming from dreams of teeth and darkness, clutching her grandmother's medicine bundle and whispering prayers to gods both old and new. The crosscut saw bit into centuries-old heartwood at dawn, its teeth screaming against timber that had stood since before Columbus touched American shores. What should have been the satisfying rhythm of productive labor became something else entirely when the blade struck hollow space 18 inches deep. This was the moment everything changed. Though none of the 10 men recognized it yet, they were too focused on the black sap that poured from the wound like blood from a severed artery. Samuel Hartwell knelt beside the gash in the ancient hemlock, running calloused fingers along bark that felt wrong under his touch. The tree's interior was honeycombed with chambers, as if something had been boring tunnels through living wood for decades. The Morrison twins, positioned on either side of their crosscut saw, stared at the cavity they'd exposed with expressions that mixed confusion and growing dread. "Never seen anything like it," muttered Patrick Morrison, wiping black residue from his hands onto canvas work pants. The substance clung like tar, but smelled of decay and something else, something metallic, that reminded Big Jim Kowalski of the slaughterhouse where he'd worked before taking up logging. Young Tommy Fletcher, eager to prove his worth, volunteered to examine the hollow more closely. He thrust his arm deep into the chamber, groping for the source of the tunneling. His confident expression shifted to puzzlement, then alarm, as his fingers encountered something that definitely wasn't wood, something that felt distinctly like bone. From the West Virginia State Mining Commission report, November 1911, preliminary examination of timber samples revealed extensive internal damage consistent with prolonged insect infestation. Though no known species creates such precise geometric patterns, the bone Tommy extracted was small, possibly from a child's hand, polished, smooth, and marked with what appeared to be teeth marks. But the arrangement inside the tree suggested deliberate placement rather than natural death. Someone or something had been feeding the hollow, cramming organic matter into living wood until the tree became a grotesque ossuary. Ezra Whitman, the camp cook whose stories usually lightened the darkest evenings, found his voice had abandoned him entirely. He'd seen similar arrangements in Cherokee burial grounds, but never inside living trees, never crafted with such methodical precision. The old stories his grandmother had whispered spoke of things that nested in sacred places, growing fat on offerings left by foolish men. But Black Rock Timber hadn't sent them here to study folklore. The crew worked through the morning, felling 3 more giants before the pattern became undeniable. Every tree contained chambers. Every chamber held bones. Human bones, animal bones, and bones from creatures none of them could identify. Femurs too long for any known species. Skulls with dental arrangements that belonged in nightmares rather than nature. The deeper they cut, the more elaborate the arrangements became. Some chambers contained entire skeletons posed in positions of supplication or agony. Others held collections of smaller bones arranged in spirals that hurt to look at directly, creating optical illusions that made seasoned loggers stumble and retch. What kind of intelligence could conceive such deliberate horror? And how long had it been preparing these trees, these offerings, these altars hidden in plain sight? By noon, 3 men had requested transfers back to safer logging sites. Hartwell denied their requests. BlackRock had invested too much in this expedition to retreat over what he termed superstitious nonsense. But privately, he'd begun calculating how quickly they could harvest enough timber to satisfy their contract and leave Devil's Hollow behind. The answer, he realized with growing horror, was never. The trees they'd already felled wouldn't float. Despite being freshly cut, the timber had taken on the density of stone, sinking like anchors when they attempted to move logs toward the creek. The wood that should have represented months of wages lay scattered across the forest floor like the bones of some massive creature, useless and immovable. Worse, the trees they'd cut were bleeding. Not sap, but something darker, thicker, that drew clouds of insects unlike any species Tommy Fletcher had studied in his grandfather's nature guides. The flies moved in geometric patterns, creating formations that echoed the bone arrangements hidden in the timber. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Big Jim Kowalski noticed that the surrounding forest had begun to respond to their presence. Trees that had stood silent for centuries now creaked and groaned despite the absence of wind. Branches swayed in rhythms that suggested breathing rather than breeze. The hollow was waking up, but what they'd awakened wasn't content to simply watch. As the sun began its descent toward the western ridges, the true nature of their situation became clear. They weren't just witnessing something ancient and hungry. They were feeding it. Twilight brought the sound of footsteps circling their camp, dozens of feet moving through underbrush with the deliberate patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. But every time one of the loggers grabbed a lantern to investigate, the forest revealed only empty spaces between trees and the lingering impression of eyes reflecting firelight. This wasn't random wildlife disturbed by their presence. The movements were too coordinated, too purposeful, suggesting an intelligence that had been studying them since they'd entered the hollow. The Morrison twins, veterans of a dozen logging camps across Appalachia, had positioned themselves back to back near the fire. Their crosscut saw within arm's reach, despite its uselessness as a weapon. Patrick's hands shook as he carved shavings for the fire, the rhythmic scraping of his knife against pine providing a soundtrack to their growing terror. "Something's been planning this," whispered Michael Morrison, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Them bones in the trees, they weren't random. Someone's been collecting, arranging, waiting." Big Jim Kowalski nodded toward the tree line where shadows moved with unnatural fluidity. During his years working Chicago slaughterhouses, he developed an instinct for dangerous situations, a sixth sense that had kept him alive through gang wars and industrial accidents. That same instinct now screamed warnings that made his skin crawl with electric anticipation. Young Tommy Fletcher huddled near Ezra Whitman, the camp cook who'd been telling stories to distract from their circumstances. But Ezra's usual repertoire of tall tales and logging legends had dried up completely. Instead, he stared into the fire with the 1,000-yard stare of a man remembering things he'd tried to forget. The sound of something large moving through the canopy above drew their attention skyward. Branches groaned under substantial weight, creating a trail of disturbance that circled their camp like a predator testing defenses. Whatever moved through the trees was big enough to bend limbs that would support a grown man, agile enough to travel from tree to tree without ever touching ground. From the personal diary of Samuel Hartwell, October 13, 1911. "The men are spooked, and truth be told, so am I. Something stalks us from the darkness, something that knows these woods better than we know our own names." Hartwell maintained his authority through sheer force of will, but privately acknowledged that their situation had moved beyond normal logging challenges. The compass continued spinning uselessly. Their escape route remained uncertain, and the growing sense of malevolent observation suggested they were no longer hunters in this forest. They were the hunted. The first direct contact came at 10:37 p.m. when something threw a human skull into their campfire. The bones struck burning logs with enough force to scatter sparks across their canvas, shelter, and the brief illumination revealed the skull's condition. Fresh, recently cleaned, bearing tool marks that suggested methodical preparation. "Jesus Christ," gasped Tommy Fletcher, scrambling backward from the fire. "That's someone's head. Someone who was alive not too long ago." But Ezra Whitman knew better. His grandmother had been Cherokee, raised on stories of things that lived in the deep woods, entities that collected offerings and demanded tribute from those who entered sacred spaces. The skull wasn't a threat or a warning. It was a demand for payment. The realization struck him like a physical blow. They weren't random victims of forest predators. They were expected guests at a feast that had been planned for generations, invited by their own greed and ignorance to participate in something far older than Black Rock Timber's corporate ambitions. What would you do, faced with evidence that your presence was not just tolerated, but anticipated? Would you flee into unknown darkness, or stand and fight something that had been preparing for your arrival since before your grandfather was born? The watchers in the trees had given them a choice, though choice implied options that didn't exist in Devil's Hollow. They could offer themselves willingly, making their deaths quick and possibly meaningful in whatever cosmic arrangement governed this place. Or they could run, providing sport for entities that had been waiting decades for fresh entertainment. As if summoned by their growing desperation, the sounds of pursuit began in earnest. Not footsteps now, but the calculated demolition of trees blocking potential escape routes. Something was herding them, cutting off exits with the methodical precision of experienced hunters. The 10 men of Black Rock's logging expedition found themselves players in a game whose rules had been written in bone and blood long before they were born, participants in a harvest that would claim far more than timber before dawn broke over Devil's Hollow. But the true horror wasn't what hunted them from the darkness. It was the growing realization that some among their own group had known this would happen, had perhaps even arranged it. The scream that shattered their midnight vigil came from Patrick Morrison, but the sound that followed, a wet, tearing noise like canvas being ripped, suggested his cry had been permanently silenced. His twin brother Michael lunged toward the darkness, where Patrick had been standing guard, only to find empty space and a trail of blood leading deeper into the hollow. This was when they discovered that not everyone in their group had been surprised by the night's events. Someone among them had been expecting this harvest all along. Ezra Whitman's steady demeanor finally cracked as he watched Michael Morrison stumble back into the firelight, clutching his brother's severed hand like a broken toy. The camp cook's carefully maintained facade of folksy storyteller crumbled, revealing something far more complex underneath. "This ain't random," Ezra announced, his voice carrying an authority that made the remaining men turn toward him. "Someone called them here. Someone made arrangements." Samuel Hartwell's expedition log would later reveal disturbing gaps in his pre-departure planning. No mention of how he'd acquired the logging rights to Devil's Hollow when previous expeditions had failed so spectacularly. No explanation for why Black Rock Timber had been willing to pay double wages for what should have been routine work. Young Tommy Fletcher, tears streaming down his face, accused everyone and no one. "Patrick's dead. Something dragged him into the woods, and we're sitting here talking about arrangements. We need to find him." But Big Jim Kowalski had noticed something that chilled him more than Patrick's disappearance. The blood trail leading from their camp didn't show signs of struggle or desperation. The spacing of the drops, the direction of the path, everything suggested Patrick had walked willingly into the darkness, perhaps even eagerly. The Polish immigrant had seen enough violence in Chicago stockyards to recognize the difference between murder and sacrifice. Patrick Morrison hadn't been taken, he'd been given. From a letter found in Samuel Hartwell's effects, dated 3 days before the expedition, the old agreements must be honored. 10 men will enter the hollow. The arrangement requires 8 to remain. Payment in full for services rendered. Michael Morrison's grief transformed into rage as implications became clear. Someone among their group had negotiated their deaths in advance, trading 8 lives for some unknown benefit. His surviving instincts kicked in with the fury of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. "Who?" he demanded, grabbing Hartwell by the shirt front. "Who made the deal? Who sold us out?" The foreman's silence spoke volumes. But before accusations could escalate into violence, the watchers in the woods announced their impatience. Trees began falling around their camp, not randomly, but strategically, creating barriers that further limited their mobility. Whatever intelligence controlled the hollow was done waiting for human drama to resolve itself. The harvest would continue on schedule, with or without their cooperation. Ezra Whitman stepped into the firelight, his weathered face reflecting years of carefully hidden knowledge. "My grandmother was Cherokee. She told me stories about this place, warnings about things that sleep in sacred ground, until foolish men wake them with saws and axes." He'd known. From the moment Hartwell had announced their destination, Ezra had understood what awaited them in Devil's Hollow. But instead of warning the others, he'd accepted his role in an ancient arrangement that demanded fresh offerings in exchange for continued tolerance of human presence in the mountains. The realization hit the survivors like a physical blow. Their trusted camp cook, the man who'd prepared their meals and told comforting stories, had been serving as liaison between Black Rock Timber and entities that viewed human life as currency. But Ezra's betrayal was only the beginning of their problems. As the night deepened and the circle of fallen trees tightened around their position, it became clear that the watchers had specific preferences about which members of their group would provide the most satisfying harvest. They wanted the young ones first. Tommy Fletcher found himself the center of unwanted attention as shapes moved closer to their dwindling fire. The 18-year-old logger had volunteered for this expedition to prove his manhood, to earn enough money to marry his sweetheart back in Beckley. Instead, he'd become the primary course in a feast that had been planned since his grandfather's time. What drives men to sacrifice others for their own survival? How do ordinary people convince themselves that trading lives for profit is simply the cost of doing business in places where old rules still apply? The answers lay scattered around their camp in the form of bones and broken promises, evidence of previous expeditions that had made similar arrangements with entities that remembered when Cherokee voices had sung these mountains to sleep. But the harvest was far from over, and the watchers had grown tired of games that had lasted too long already. The attack came at 3:17 a.m. with the surgical precision of predators who'd been studying their prey for hours, learning weaknesses, and calculating the most efficient method of collection. Tommy Fletcher's scream echoed off limestone cliffs as something dragged him backward through their defensive circle, his fingernails leaving desperate scratches in forest soil that would outlast his life. This was no longer a siege, but an active harvest, conducted by entities that treated human terror as seasoning for their feast. Big Jim Kowalski threw himself after the retreating sounds of struggle, his massive frame crashing through underbrush with the determination of a man who'd already lost too much to stand by and watch more disappear. But the darkness swallowed Tommy's cries as completely as if the forest itself had opened its mouth and consumed him. Michael Morrison, still clutching his brother's severed hand, had reached the breaking point where grief transforms into murderous clarity. He turned on Ezra Whitman with the fury of a man who discovered that trust was just another weapon used against him. "How many?" he demanded, pressing his logging knife against the cook's throat. "How many expeditions have you guided into this slaughter? How many men have you fed to whatever lives in these woods?" Ezra's answer came in the form of silence that stretched like a noose around the remaining survivors. But his eyes, reflecting firelight with the cold calculation of a man who'd made peace with necessary evils, told the story his voice wouldn't. Samuel Hartwell attempted to maintain leadership even as his expedition disintegrated around him. from his later testimony to West Virginia authorities. The men had become irrational, turning on each other instead of focusing on survival. But looking back, I understand their rage. We'd all been played. The foreman's confession would reveal the true scope of the arrangement. Black Rock Timber hadn't stumbled into Devil's Hollow by accident. They'd been invited by entities that required periodic offerings in exchange for allowing logging operations elsewhere in the Appalachian Range. The company's stockholders had weighed the cost of losing 8 men against the profits from harvesting timber across 12 other mountain sites. The mathematics of murder had proven favorable to their bottom line, but mathematics couldn't protect them now that the harvest had begun in earnest. Something moved through the canopy above, with the confidence of a creature that knew every branch and shadow in its territory. The remaining men could hear Tommy Fletcher's voice growing fainter as whatever had claimed him carried its prize deeper into the hollow. The forest had become a living thing, responding to their presence with malevolent intelligence. Trees leaned inward to block potential escape routes. Roots emerged from the ground to trip fleeing men. Even the air seemed to thicken with each passing hour, making breath laborious and thought sluggish. Young Tommy's final scream cut off abruptly, leaving behind silence more terrifying than any sound. In that quiet, the survivors heard something else. The wet, methodical sounds of feeding, echoing from somewhere deeper in the woods. Death comes for the innocent first. Big Jim stumbled back into their camp, his clothes torn and his face bearing scratches from thorns that hadn't existed during daylight hours. His search for Tommy had revealed the true scope of their situation. The hollow extended far deeper than their maps suggested, honeycomb with caves and passages that suggested decades of preparation. "It's not just one thing," he gasped, accepting water from their dwindling supplies. "There's a whole system down there. Chambers, storage areas. Like they've been planning this for years." The Polish immigrant had discovered something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his shortened life. The caves contained evidence of previous expeditions, organized by company and year. Personal effects, arranged with museum-quality precision. Clothing, tools, documents that detailed the formal agreements between Black Rock, Timber, and entities that predated European settlement. Michael Morrison's rage had crystallized into something more focused and dangerous. He'd stopped questioning why this was happening and started planning how to make someone pay for his brother's death. His logging knife reflected firelight as he studied Ezra Whitman with the attention of a man selecting cuts of meat. But revenge would have to wait. The Watchers had decided that 3:17 a.m. marked the end of their patience with human drama. The real harvest was about to begin, and the remaining survivors would learn that Tommy Fletcher's disappearance had been just the appetizer. What approached their camp now moved with the confidence of apex predators who'd been toying with their food long enough to grow bored with games that had lost their entertainment value. The feast was about to begin in earnest, and someone among the survivors was about to discover that their role in tonight's arrangement was far more significant than they'd realized. The thing that emerged from the tree line at 4:41 a.m. stood 8 feet tall on legs that bent wrong. Its flesh, the color of old bark, and twice as rough. But what froze the surviving loggers wasn't its appearance. It was the intelligence behind eyes that reflected their dying campfire with predatory patience. This was the moment they understood that everything they'd believed about their situation had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. The creature moved with deliberate slowness, savoring their terror like wine. Its hands, if they could be called hands, ended in fingers that extended into root-like tendrils capable of boring through living wood or human bone with equal efficiency. When it spoke, the words emerged in perfect English, tinged with accents that predated the arrival of Europeans in these mountains. "Samuel Hartwell," it said, pronouncing each syllable with the care of someone reading from a formal contract. "You have brought us what was promised, 8 offerings for 8 years of undisturbed harvest. The arrangement will be fulfilled." Michael Morrison's knife trembled in his grip as understanding crashed over him like cold water. This wasn't random predation or ancient evil awakened by careless logging. This was business, conducted according to agreements, signed in boardrooms, and honored in blood. Big Jim Kowalski had seen enough violence in Chicago stockyards to recognize the difference between slaughter and ceremony. What they were witnessing was ritual, performed with the precision of entities that had been refining their methods for centuries. From the final entry in Samuel Hartwell's expedition log, "God forgive me, I knew, we all knew. Black Rock's prophets required sacrifice, and we were the most expedient currency." Ezra Whitman stepped forward, his role as intermediary finally revealed. For 30 years, he'd been facilitating these arrangements, guiding expeditions into Devil's Hollow, and ensuring that the ancient hungers were satisfied according to terms negotiated by men in suits who never intended to honor their contracts personally. 8 men, Ezra confirmed, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was orchestrating. As agreed. The company maintains its logging rights across the Eastern Range, and you receive fresh offerings to sustain another decade of peaceful coexistence. The creature's laugh sounded like wind through dead leaves, rustling with amusement at human presumption. Coexistence? We do not coexist, little cook. We tolerate. We allow. And tolerance requires constant renewal. What followed was a negotiation conducted in whispers and gestures that excluded the men whose lives were being bartered. Hartwell and Ezra discussed logistics with the casual efficiency of businessmen arranging a delivery schedule, while the creature listened with the patience of something that had participated in similar conversations for generations. The true horror wasn't the monster that had emerged from the woods. It was the realization that monsters in suits had been feeding it from corporate boardrooms, using human resources in the most literal sense possible. Michael Morrison's grief had evolved into something more dangerous than rage. He'd begun to understand that his brother's death was just one line item in an accounting ledger that balanced human lives against quarterly profits. The knowledge burned through him like acid, corroding everything he'd believed about civilization and order. But understanding the scope of their betrayal didn't provide escape from its consequences. The creature had specific requirements about how the harvest would be conducted, preferences developed through decades of experience with human offerings. It wanted them to run. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, not because the entity needed exercise, but because terror improved the flavor of what it consumed. The remaining loggers were about to participate in a chase that had been choreographed to provide maximum entertainment for appetites that viewed human suffering as the finest seasoning. Big Jim grabbed his axe with the determination of a man who decided that dying fighting was preferable to dying as entertainment. But weapons designed for cutting wood proved useless against creatures that were more plant than animal, more force of nature than physical entity. The forest itself had become their enemy, responding to some alien will that commanded roots and branches with the authority of absolute ownership. Trees reached for them with grasping limbs, while the ground opened into sinkholes that led to chambers filled with the remains of previous offerings. As dawn approached Devil's Hollow with reluctant light, the surviving members of Black Rock's expedition faced the final phase of an arrangement that had never intended for any of them to leave these woods alive. But somewhere in the growing chaos, one man had begun to formulate a plan that might save at least some of them, even if it meant embracing the very evil they'd been trying to escape. The sound of snapping bones echoed through the hollow as Big Jim Kowalski's makeshift spear punched through the creature's chest, only to watch in horror as the wound sealed itself around the wooden shaft, like bark growing over a nail. At 5:53 a.m., with dawn painting the mountain ridges pink, he discovered that some hungers are too old to be killed by conventional weapons. This was the moment the last survivors learned that escape would require a different kind of sacrifice, one that would stain their souls as permanently as bloodstains would. Michael Morrison had moved beyond grief into a state of crystalline clarity that comes when a man loses everything worth protecting. His brother was dead, fed to entities that viewed human life as currency in transactions negotiated by men in distant cities. But clarity brought its own kind of power, and power could be directed with surgical precision. "Ezra," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd embraced necessary damnation. "You know how this works. You know what they want. Tell me how to turn this around." The camp cook's weathered face reflected 30 years of facilitating arrangements that balanced human lives against corporate profits. But something in Morrison's tone suggested that the traditional power dynamic was about to shift in ways that Blackrock Timber had never anticipated. From the personal notes of Ezra Whitman, found sewn into his jacket lining, "The mountains remember everything. Every broken treaty, every stolen life, every promise made and abandoned. They collect interest on old debts with compound patience." The creature stalking them through morning mist moved with the confidence of a predator that had never encountered serious resistance. For decades, its kind had harvested offerings delivered by compliant intermediaries, men like Ezra who understood that survival sometimes required collaboration with forces beyond human comprehension. But Michael Morrison was no longer thinking about survival in conventional terms. His brother's death had freed him from the constraints of normal morality, creating space for solutions that honorable men couldn't consider. "What do they need?" he pressed, cornering Ezra against a tree whose bark bore familiar spiral carvings. "What keeps them satisfied? What makes them go back to sleep?" The answer came not from Ezra, but from Samuel Hartwell, whose expedition logs would later reveal the full scope of his complicity. "Blood," he admitted, his authority as foreman crumbling under the weight of confession. "Fresh blood offered willingly. But not just any blood. Blood from someone who understands the terms, who chooses sacrifice over escape." Morrison's knife found Hartwell's throat with the efficiency of a man who'd spent his life cutting through obstacles. But instead of ending the foreman's life, he pressed just hard enough to draw blood, letting crimson drops fall onto soil that seemed to absorb them with greedy anticipation. "Then let's give them what they want," Morrison declared, understanding flooding through him like revelation. "But not on their terms, on ours." The forest responded to the scent of willingly shed blood with interest that bordered on hunger. Trees leaned closer. The creature pursuing them paused, sensing a change in the dynamic that had governed these exchanges for generations. What Morrison proposed violated every natural instinct for self-preservation, but it offered something that desperate men couldn't resist: the possibility of turning victim into victor, even if victory required embracing the very evil they'd been trying to escape. Big Jim Kowalski, still clutching his useless spear, recognized the logic even as it horrified him. Someone was going to die in Devil's Hollow before sunrise finished painting the mountains. The only question was whether those deaths would serve the agenda of entities that had been feeding on human terror for centuries, or whether the survivors could find a way to make their sacrifice count for something more. The creature emerged from morning shadows with deliberate slowness, sensing that its carefully orchestrated hunt had taken an unexpected turn. For the first time in decades, its prey was no longer running but planning, no longer victims but potential adversaries. But entities that had survived since before European settlement didn't reach that age by underestimating human desperation. The thing advancing on their position had participated in countless variations of this negotiation, and experience had taught it that cornered humans often produced the most satisfying entertainment. As morning light strengthened and the hollow revealed its true scope, cave mouths that descended into chambers filled with the organized remains of previous expeditions, Morrison's plan crystallized into something that might actually work, if they were willing to pay the price it demanded. The explosion at 6:27 a.m. shattered the morning quiet, as Michael Morrison detonated 3 sticks of dynamite salvaged from their mining supplies, bringing down a limestone overhang that sealed the cave entrance behind him. Inside the collapsing chamber, something that had fed on human terror for centuries found itself trapped with a man who'd embraced his own damnation. This was how one survivor escaped Devil's Hollow, NE9, by ensuring that what hunted them could never hunt again. Big Jim Kowalski later testified to West Virginia authorities that Morrison's sacrifice had given him and Samuel Hartwell the opportunity they needed to reach the creek and follow it downstream toward civilization. But Kowalski's account omitted crucial details about what they'd witnessed in those final moments. Revelations that would have challenged everything the investigators thought they understood about the natural world. The creature had screamed as the limestone came down, a sound that reverberated through every tree in the hollow like the death cry of the forest itself. But its death throes revealed something more disturbing than its existence. It hadn't been alone. The chamber Morrison had sealed contained dozens of similar entities, an entire colony that had been using Devil's Hollow as a base for operations that extended far beyond a single mountain valley. From the final testimony of Samuel Hartwell, given at Charleston General Hospital, Morrison saved us, but not in the way you'd think. He didn't kill the thing, he joined it. Last thing I saw before the cave came down was Michael Morrison's eyes reflecting light that wasn't quite human anymore. Hartwell died 3 days after giving his testimony, his body showing signs of rapid aging that physicians couldn't explain. His final words, whispered to a nurse who'd worked Cherokee communities, were in a language that predated European settlement. The mountains remember, the debt transfers, the hunger finds new servants. Big Jim Kowalski lived another 47 years, but never again worked in forests or mountains. He moved to Detroit, finding employment in automobile factories, where the only trees were those planted by city planners in neat, orderly rows. His nightmares never stopped featuring the sound of Michael Morrison's laughter echoing from sealed caves. The Black Rock Timber Company folded within 6 months, its investors spooked by investigations that raised uncomfortable questions about previous expeditions and missing personnel. Company records, when finally unsealed by court order, revealed a pattern of arranged disappearances that stretched back to the 1870s. But the hollow itself remained untouched by human industry. Local Cherokee communities, led by descendants of families who'd never forgotten the old stories, petitioned successfully to have the area designated as sacred ground. Official surveys listed it as unsuitable for development due to unstable geology and unusual mineral deposits. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. The mountains themselves had learned to protect what they contained, using human agents when necessary to maintain arrangements that served appetites older than recorded history. Hikers occasionally reported strange phenomena in the area, compasses spinning uselessly, electronic devices failing without explanation, and the persistent sensation of being watched by intelligence that recognized them as potential additions to collections maintained in chambers that descended far deeper than any official survey had documented. In 1993, a group of college students camping near Devil's Hollow discovered human remains arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The bones showed tool marks consistent with methodical preparation, and carbon dating revealed ages that spanned nearly a century. The site was quickly sealed by federal authorities and classified under regulations that remain in effect today. What drives mountains to remember? What transforms landscapes into active participants in arrangements that trade human lives for territorial peace? The answers lay buried in chambers that Michael Morrison had sealed with his own transformation, protected by guardians who'd learned that some hungers required willing servants rather than unwilling victims. Local Cherokee elders still burned sage on certain nights, speaking words their grandmothers taught them, maintaining treaties with entities that view human civilization as a temporary inconvenience requiring occasional management. They know that the debt Morrison had assumed continues to accumulate interest, and that Devil's Hollow waits patiently for the next time payment comes due. But the mountains are patient, and some debts compound over generations until they require collections that reshape entire regions according to appetites that remember when Cherokee voices sang these ridges to sleep. Even today, experienced loggers avoid certain valleys in the Appalachian range, guided by instincts they can't explain, and warnings passed down through generations of men who understand that some timber isn't worth the price it demands. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.